Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The NARM therapist training is an advanced clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and C-PTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by faculty members Brad Kammer, Stephanie Klein, and Marcia Black. If you are working in the field of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to get trained in NARM. For more information and to reserve your spot, please visit www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. And now for our interview. Jeanette LeBlanc is a writer, facilitator, coach, teacher, motivational speaker, and self-published author of You Are Not Too Much: Love Notes of Heartache, Redemption, and Reclamation. Whether she is working to guide a group focused on writing the memoir of their lived experience or working one-on-one with clients who desire a life of freedom, Jeanette walks alongside humans on their journeys to increased sovereignty, truth, and bravery, using the stories of their lived experiences as the vehicle to expand into authenticity, courage, and expression. Please enjoy my conversation with Jeanette LeBlanc. Okay, Jeanette LeBlanc, thank you for coming on Transforming Trauma.
I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy to see you. So I'm really excited to talk about the work that you're doing because I've been, obviously, we have a history. We've known each other for several years. And I've sort of admired some things from afar. We've never had like an in-depth conversation about writing and the work that you're doing. So this is my chance to sort of nerd out on where our spaces of work intersect, which is actually, there's a lot of intersection there. So if you wouldn't mind, could you share with us what you would hope for listeners to walk away from our conversation today?
Well, first off, we have a history. Sounds really mysterious, and I like it. And in terms of what I would hope people would come away with is just really an understanding of how writing or the process of diving into the stories that live in you both can facilitate your own healing and can be of value to the wider world as we look for sources of understanding and connection.
Sources of understanding and connection.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I'm excited to explore this. So listeners will have heard a little bit about you, but if you can share with us what it is that you're doing in the space of healing trauma and maybe a little bit about your background.
Well, the first thing is that this direction in life was totally accidental. I have a science degree, worked as a clinical research coordinator, had no intention, didn't even understand myself as a creative being until I got pregnant with my first daughter and started writing. Way back in the pre-blog days, way back in the days where if you build it, they will come, where you just had to have a story and there wasn't this constant noise around us all, no social media. And over the time, that kind of naturally segued into answering questions about writing for other people, which turned into leading courses and workshops and becoming a coach and facilitator and speaker. And I would have had no idea in the beginning that my work would intersect with trauma. Like I was just telling my story as a mother, as a human alive on this earth. But it turns out, especially when you start teaching or guiding people with story, what people are wanting to write about is a lot of trauma. It's the stories we're carrying around with us that start to feel really heavy when they're in the inside and we want to get them out. We want there to be a purpose in all of that. And I think it's really important to say when I started leading writing workshops, what I didn't know was how little I knew about what a big responsibility I was taking on holding that circle. So after my first course, I started including some trauma education with someone who was trained and knowledgeable and way more aware of what people needed to know than me. So I brought in other people. And I think over time, I started to understand more and more about how to guide that and how to be safe. I don't think my first writing course was safe because I did not have the knowledge to hold that space appropriately. And I had to learn it quickly.
Mm. And you're bringing me right to the piece of like what had me thinking we needed to hear from you was this piece of your understanding that there does need to be a container for all of this and your way of guiding them through. So I'm excited to hear more about what you're doing to support these folks as they're writing because like I said, I think you're doing something really different than maybe how I've experienced it myself and maybe how I've seen it done. It feels very aligned with the way that I work as a therapist. So
Can't wait to dig in.
I mean, can you tell us a little bit about what brought you to writing? I mean, you said motherhood. What happened for you?
I'm from Canada and I live in Phoenix, so I was far away from all of my family, and it was a way to share the story and what was happening. And then there was a parenting website that had diaries. So again, pre-blogs, you had to send in the pictures you wanted to do. Someone uploaded them separately. It was and I think it was that I got a response right away. And people were getting involved in the story and interested and invested in the story. And so I just kept, it was a truly complete accident. And then, the pivot point where it became even deeper, I had a couple of years of what they called mommy bloggers at the time, right? I was writing really solely about my kids and my life as a wife and that container. And then at 32, which seems like a lifetime ago now, I came out as queer and left my marriage and kind of did that whole dismantling, deconstructing of a life. And I started looking for my story online. And I found a lot of stories about coming out, even later coming out, but I couldn't find my particular story because I loved my husband and we had a good marriage and we were happy or content. I found a lot of stories about people who were miserable. So I thought, okay, if I'm up late at night looking for this story, there's got to be other people who are looking for this story. I'm going to start writing it, which I did anonymously for a very long time. And I think that's where I learned how to be a more honest writer because I didn't have to worry for the first time about people I knew or people whose stories were intersecting with mine, reading it and being upset about it. So I stopped curating the bits of my story for other people. It was probably the most honest writing I have ever done in my life. And then somehow, instead of becoming someone who wrote, that kind of brought me into being a writer.
So you started to identify as a writer.
Yeah. And there was an anthology of coming out stories. So I submitted to that and then had to decide, would I stay anonymous or would I put my name with? And I made the decision to add my name to that story because it was in a book out in the world. And that changed two things. I couldn't be as honest in my writing online anymore about that particular thing. So I learned how by making that choice, for me at the time, impacted my ability to write my way through this in a way I hadn't anticipated. But it also involved me stepping into my name as a writer, as a published writer for the first time. There's something to getting a book, and even if your story is only on a few pages, but seeing your name on the page with your words. And of course, you're valid as a writer if you never get published. You're a writer as long as you have this urge in yourself to tell stories, even if you haven't gotten it out yet. But there's definitely something about that moment that shifts the trajectory, I think. For me.
Yeah. Yeah. And just witnessing, dear listener, you can't see Jeanette's face right now, but as you started talking about that, you were now identifying as a writer. And the way you talked about that, I just got chills and your face is just like glowing. I love that. Yeah. Your writing lights you up.
It does.
Yeah. So you said the phrase, write your way through. And that's a piece that I'm really interested in. Number one, how you've written your way through, and there's been this unfolding, and then also how you're supporting and guiding women and folks to write their way through.
Well, the first thing that I thought when you said that was a quote from Joan Didion, who is one of my writing heroes. It was from an essay called Why I Write. And she said, I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see, and what it means. So for me, the starting point of writing, no matter where it ends up, is always for me a way to kind of dismantle all of these disparate pieces and all of these things and find out actually what's living at the heart of that for me. And it can be a messy and really raw process. I'm not just talking about the writing that goes into the public. I'm talking about the scrawling mess in my journal of really self-indulgent, like, I'm going to go into the depths of this. And it's become a path for me of actually understanding what lies beneath that top level understanding that we carry around with us, of digging in and excavating how all of the stories of my life are coming together into this particular moment to create what I'm experiencing.
Something that comes up for me is creating a container that feel that there's safety or enough safety, maybe. So can we talk about how you do that? Is there a framework or something that you're working with to create that kind of container in the writing?
For me in my writing, I mean, I get a lot of kudos or people saying, you're so brave and so open and so honest. And it's important for me to say, I've been doing this now. My daughter is 22. So for 23 years, I have been practicing the art of cracking open my insides and putting them into words that I can put out to the world. You should not expect yourself to be able to go to that level right away. It would be hugely dysregulating for most people to try to reach that kind of public-facing honesty. It can be dysregulating to do it in your journal and to get to those depths of honesty when nobody else is going to see. So that takes work and that takes practice. And I was not there 20 years ago. I was certainly not there 10 years ago. I wasn't even where I am now 5 years ago. And then the other thing with that, then when I'm teaching writing or when I'm coaching people, is I actually needed to learn those frameworks of how trauma works in order to be safe enough, like you said. Like calling myself a safe writing coach, I think is taking on a whole lot of responsibility. I try to be the safest guide that I can be and to arm myself with the knowledge so that I can do it safely. But the first step really in that process, if you're going to be diving into the deep and tender and like the real muck underneath what we show the world a lot of the time, you first need to learn what your body feels like when it's regulated and when it's not. Because a lot of us don't notice dysregulation until we're over the top level, right? We're in red lights flashing mode. So a huge part, the beginning part, is actually paying attention to what your energy is doing. What are the physiological and emotional signs that your writing is actually pulling you into an unsafe place? You know when to back off and stay away. When we were chatting before the show, I used the analogy of surfing. Well, I don't know why I use that analogy because I've never surfed in my life. But if you were going to start surfing, you wouldn't go to Hawaii to those monstrous, huge, terrifying waves and get on a surfboard and expect yourself to be safe. You would start in the sheltered cove with no waves and a guide, and you'd first learn in the very shallow waters to stand up, expecting yourself to dive into this story, all of the painful realities that live inside of you, all the things you haven't figured out yet. These forces that end up driving our behavior and our actions and our emotions that are operating under the surface, right? They're under the currents of that water, deep water. You've got to build your capacity for doing that. A lot of people talk about, little T trauma or big T trauma. So there's little T truths and big T truths. And if you write broke on the big T, it might be fine. And you might find yourself completely blowing open your own capacity for exposure, for the activation of that story, to the point where the only thing your body can think of to do is to pull it back in, close the doors, lock it down. And if you want to get your story out into the world, whether it's just for you or whether it's for other people, it's really important to understand what's happening in us when we tell the story. And that's true for telling the story out loud. It's true for telling a story to your therapist. It's definitely true when you're writing the story down, especially if you intend for it to be public in any way.
Yeah. There's a couple of things you're naming that I just want to highlight. So this idea of you started with just curiosity. We have to learn about our own experience. And in the NARM framework or the NARM model, curiosity is such a foundational piece of our processes. Just sort of, I'm remembering just being in my first training and, there was kind of an exercise of noticing what's happening. And I was sort of dipping in and out because I had to titrate it. I could not go straight in, even just to my physical sensations. And I had to notice, wow, I need a lot of disconnection because it's so much. It's so much. It was so overwhelming. I didn't have the capacity what you're talking about to really be and fully be present. And I needed that. I mean, it was a strategy that had kept me going forward my whole life,
Right.
30 something years. And so to build that capacity, is so vital. And you're naming it in the writing space. And that's what I love. I'm so excited.
Which carries forward. So if you learn it for writing, or if you learn it as a therapist, or wherever you learn that, then you've learned something about your body and your own response and what happens to you when activation happens. The energy of trauma is really often urgency. But regulation has all the time in the world, right?
Yeah.
So if you start feeling that energy building up and out instead of down and grounding you in while you're in the process of diving into the story, it's time to back off, even if you really want to go for broke and get there. I know in my own therapy, sometimes I just want to go in hard, and then I end up with my brain swirling afterwards and have to really work to bring myself back in.
Yeah. It's interesting as you said that. I think of how sometimes a client might come in and be like, I'm ready. I want to do the work. Like, I want like the tough massage, like, which I'm kind of that person. I'll walk in and I'm like, dig in deep. And they're like, actually, that probably wouldn't be a good idea because your body cannot handle that right now. We need to like start slow, titrate the process. And just like you're naming, like this translates into so many different areas. So it's not just in therapy. We're talking in writing. We're talking in all these other ways. So building capacity.
Right. Because we live in this world that has separated us from our body, from the sensations and experience that we're having. Because in order to cope in this world a lot, you have to do what you said. You have to disconnect. You have to disengage with that deeper wisdom in order to just get through a day. Because we're not, let's face it, we all know we're not living the way human beings are meant to live. Absolutely not.
Yeah, there's so much we could say about that. But okay, so back to this framework. So you're talking about building capacity. I remember you mentioning something about writing a labyrinth.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
That's another thing. So if anyone listening, I'm assuming we've encountered the idea of a labyrinth, even if we haven't walked a labyrinth ourselves. But when you do, and I'm an impatient person, I like to get right to the point too, just like you. Give me the hard massage. That's a great analogy. I'm going to take that one and steal it. But when you are walking a labyrinth, you start at a point and you weave your way around in a way that's determined by the lines of the labyrinth, whether they're just rocks on the ground or whether they're high hedges or whatever. You can't get into the center any faster than you can get into the center. And to do that, it can feel really frustrating and weird if you haven't done this before and if you don't understand the contemplative and meditative nature of this, because sometimes you're heading away from the center and you're heading over and then you double back and then you're going in and out. And you're right, we want to get to the center. I know this is the core of the painful story that is still impacting my life this many years later. I don't want to be bound to this story anymore. I don't want to be bound to this experience in this way. So let's go to that one. And again, if you don't have the capacity built to do that, that's not safe. It's a completely dysregulating experience, especially if you don't have the support on the other end or a plan on the other end to bring you back out. Because once you get to the center of the labyrinth, you still have to walk all the way back out. Yeah. And again, that's a windy, twisty, turny path. You can use so many metaphors. You can talk about layers of the onion you have to peel. There's so many ways to talk about this. So how do we learn to write the labyrinth? So we might dip in close to this story, and then actually the life trajectory brings us away from it for a while. And we might go off to the side because this sideline comes back and impacts that story. But walking the labyrinth for me is a way of understanding all the pieces that come together, because it's never just that one core thing. Right. There's everything before that and everything after that that ties, the spider webs into that individual experience. I have a draft ready that hasn't been published yet. And it's basically around the reason you're not writing has nothing to do with writing. The thing you think is the thing is probably not the thing. Right? Yep. Again, that's happened to me in my own therapy and healing journey. It wasn't the big blaring red light thing that I thought I had to work on. It was something way lower and quieter and underneath. So how do we get to that piece? If we're so attached to what story wants to be told, if we decide ahead of time, again, whether we're writing or we're telling it, if we've already got the meaning made in our minds, we're going to tell a story that we're controlling and that we're guiding and that we're packaging up, right?
Couple things you're saying here that just are like landing so deep. So you said this piece about we don't want to feel bound to the story. And then this piece about, we get so attached. We can get so attached to the story. And I want to bring it back to that's why I feel, again, witnessing and kind of observing and watching you in your work. I see how story work, it can be so useful when it's done, how I hear you talking about it, when we're not so attached to what we think it is. And there's kind of an openness and sort of an open hand grasp of like, what is this that I'm working with here? What is it actually going to unfold to be, instead of, feeling so bound and attached to what we think it is? And that, I think, is when what I named for you before we started pressing record is sometimes when I've written, I've done that. I've been so attached and my fist is gripped and I'm like, this is what the story is. And it's not what the story is. It's not the thing that I think is a thing. And then I've sort of, I don't know how else to say it, but sort of almost re-traumatizing myself by holding on to that story.
Right.
And so what you're describing just feels so important, to have kind of that openness of, whatever it's going to unfold to be, and letting this story, I don't know if story writing itself is the thing. How would you describe it? What is it actually happening?
Well, first off, I wanted to stop and say, if people are still with us and they're thinking, but I don't want to write. Writing is just a way to get the words out. It's just a way to get the meaning out. And it can happen in so many different ways. Like I actually think that when it comes to real, true writing, the words are the last part and the least of it. So you can use writing as a metaphor for speaking. All of these principles would go if you were talking to a best friend, or you're talking to a therapist, or you're going to a class. We'll use the word framework again. The frameworks are all the same.
Yeah. They
apply to your life, whether you ever intend to put pen to paper. And most of my clients, most of the people who come to my courses are people I call, but I'm not a writers.
Oh, maybe I need to take that course.
That's my favorite.
something just opened
You're
in me.
welcome
Like,
anytime.
But I'm not a writer.
So there's the understanding regulation. There's the building capacity. There's the labyrinth, and not being too attached to the idea that you have to go to the center and the heart of the painful thing, whatever it is, in capital letters. And then there's when you are writing into those places that are tender, whether the big T or the little t, is to not just write your way down and into something, because then you get stuck. A friend and incredible author, Lydia Yuknovich, calls it in the basement. We don't want to get you stuck in the basement of your story. Again, whether you're writing it, whether you're telling it. I think a lot of us who have been through therapy have had that feeling of, I've gotten all the way into this and then my 50 minutes are up. I'm like, what now? So if you haven't created a plan for yourself of how to get out of that space, like I do my therapy virtually and I've got a meeting right afterwards, and my brain and heart are stuck in the basement of this story that I've been delving into and unpacking with my therapist, I'm going to walk around feeling crazy, weird, and upset and not quite right all day. So when I teach, when we're writing into those spaces, is to plot your story arc ahead of time. So most of the time we might be writing into something that's ongoing, but most of the time when people come to me, they're writing into things that have already happened. So they know what comes next. So to even have jotted out the story arc of that, where you go down and in, but then through and out and up again, kind of like picturing this curve. How are you going to get yourself out? Did you drop yourself a rope? Did you put a ladder? Did you dig some steps into the dirt? What are you going to do to get yourself out of that space? Because even if you've built your capacity and you've walked the labyrinth and you've done it all fast, it's still likely going to be in some way dysregulating to get to the real heart of the piece, especially if you've been digging for a long time. It's not easy to sit with the things we're experiencing and the pain our bodies hold. It's just not. And it's not always gentle. But you've got to have a plan in place if you're going to go, dive down into these places of how you get out. If you only plan that first part of the trip, you could end up stuck. And we don't ever want that.
Yeah. And that's the piece that to me feels like what creates the safe enough container, because okay, well, I've got it planned out. It's like, I know how I'm going to get out of this canyon. I was like picturing the Grand Canyon, like going down one side and out the other. Like, what's the plan?
I know. I was thinking, what do I say? Because I talk with my hands. So listeners, after I am making a lot of gestures, people who video me get the best freeze frames out of me.
It's like rim to rim, Grand Canyon. How do we go
Yes.
down and in a way that we feel confident or
Right.
is safe enough that we know that there's an exit?
Do you have enough food and water to feel you out?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a guide that knows the steps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the work that you're doing in the coaching and the speaking and these groups that you run, it's interesting to me that you use the word that it happened by accident, because I just
Complete
feel
accident.
like what you're doing does not feel accidental. But that
Right.
aside,
I'm sure the universe had a wider plan, right?
feels so intentional.
But now my brain wants to make a metaphor out of that too, because you talked about the storytelling itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'd constrained my idea of who I was supposed to be, I might still be working in a lab in a white coat, running clinical research studies. Who knows? Thinking I wasn't that creative. But we do this in life all the time. We let the story of our lives tell themselves. We can try to control it and try to lock it down. I guess another way to think of this as a mother is we often have deep visions of who and what our children are going to become and how they're going to live their life. And the process of parenting is this one big, long letting go that we actually can't control that. They are going to become who they're going to become. Your story is going to form itself in a way that a lot of it has to do with you. You can choose what to share, how to share it, what to dive into. But the story itself has its own engine.
Yeah, that's really landing for me.
It can be really hard to let go of the reins on that. You know, I also write a lot about this process of rushing to tell a story before it's finished. So we want to make meaning out of it before the actual meaning has been made in our living. And that doesn't mean I don't believe sometimes you need to actively write through what you're experiencing, finding a thread of the story, but deciding what it means, deciding that this is why, this is what, this is how, this is where, while you're still in the process of living, can really constrain you to this narrow idea. I think we've all encountered, right? The accidental writing career is an example. We have an idea of where we're going. If you're traveling and you know exactly where you're going and you never stop and you never detour and you never meander, you miss a lot of what you would learn and experience along the way. And again, I can take it back to a therapeutic model. Same thing when you start telling a story in therapy. When you start speaking about your life, you know, you think you're speaking about your mother and suddenly you've twisted back to this story on the schoolyard with kids. And then that winds through to a romantic relationship you had. There's so many connections and so many ways to plot the course of this. Sometimes it's really important to just let the story be before you try to force it into a box.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm thinking about, working with clients and just exactly what you're describing. Like, I think we can all, and I'll speak for myself, but like I've walked in where I'm like, okay, I want to figure out this thing. And, in the NAR model, we sort of have an intention, like, what are we wanting for ourselves? When we walk back out into the world, kind of like what you named, do I have a work meeting right after this? Like, how do I want to be sort of exiting the room or, logging off the computer? How do I want to, experience? What's the state I want to be in? And then what's being open and curious enough to see where that meanders and not gripping so tight to it. But yeah, I'm thinking about how I've walked in. I'm like, hey, I want to solve this problem. I want to eradicate this. I want to get rid of this. And it's like, oh, that's interesting to just notice what's why am I trying to eradicate that? Why am I trying to get rid of that? What's underneath that? So you're naming something that feels really important. Yeah,
I've written about it in the context of romantic relationship too. Like I decided what a love story was and what it meant and wrote about it from that perspective. And I was determined to make it into the story that I had decided early on that was going to be, so determined that it took me a really long time to see that it wasn't that at all. I was attached to my story and not the experience of what was actually happening.
Attached to your story and not the experience of what was happening. Ooh.
Yeah. Very humbling.
Yeah. Yeah. Can we talk about the last year?
Yes, we can talk about the last year.
I don't want to make you dive into the story before it's over. So
I think that's another thing about building capacity and the practice of this. After 20 some years, and this is something I have to actually watch and check myself against. I know how I have the skills to tell stories without revealing more than I want to reveal. And that's a craft and experience thing. And it takes some time to develop that. So I know what is public facing and what is mine.
Cool.
And sometimes I, get the lines blurred a little bit, but I'm pretty good at this time. So much so that I have to guard against practice vulnerability. So I look like I'm saying big things, but I'm not risking anything at all. That's a really important thing. My children are older. I'm not married. My family mostly stays away from my writing. My income is not dependent on what story. Like, there's no loss to me by telling this bravely. A lot of us have a lot hanging on the ability to do that. A lot of people cannot do that. So I have to watch and make sure, am I actually being brave in my writing? Or do I just know how to do it in the way that I stay comfortable? Because if I'm not skirting the edge of that, if I'm not inching my way in, then I'm doing a disservice to the story and to the people reading it. But for the first time in that 20-some years, I stopped writing publicly. I didn't have a public face. I didn't really, there's that meme about I don't want to be perceived right now. Well, I didn't want to be perceived. And that was really disorienting and strange for me. But over time, I came to understand that I was not writing the story of what happened because I was still living the story of what happened. And this time, for some reason, it seemed essential to not make meaning out of it before I had all the information and all the lived experience to really determine what this was. So I kind of went dark and I pulled away. I wrote in my journal a lot, things that will never see the light of day, but I did not write publicly because it wasn't my time to. And it was strange, and it was really instructive to me as a writing teacher too. I think I'll take that experience into my next course or with my next client. Because sometimes we are not ready yet.
Yeah.
Ooh, again, humbling. So human. So frustratingly, unavoidably human. But I think that determining what is ours, what is for the close and trusted, the circle of trust, and what is for the world is really a huge part of keeping ourselves safe. Another thing I say is that, yes, you are a writer. The world's waiting for you to tell your story, and nobody can tell that story but you. Nobody. Even if we've lived the exact same experience as the story I'm going to tell and the meaning I'm going to make is different than the one you're going to tell and the meaning you're going to make. And my story might not resonate, even if it has very similar bones. Because I'm not telling the story someone needs in that moment. Your story might be exactly what they need, the way you frame it, the way you understand it. And again, that counts if you're just telling your best friend. I think it even counts energetically if you're just sharing it out loud or in your head. When you're able to stand in the truth of your experience and to name it and to live with it, you move through the world differently. On that note, and like standing in the truth of your experience and your story, one of the most powerful, it is one of the simplest or seemingly simplest prompts that I have that I use. It's a pretty simple line, but when you break it down, this is what I know, not what I believe, not what I think. Like, this is what I know to be true, not projection, not possibility. Like, what feels true, what feels alive. I think when we speak truth, our bodies know it.
Yeah.
Our brains might not always be able to determine. We might not be able to determine someone else's truth, but we know when we're speaking something that's true. So this is what I know to be true for me, not for my family, not for my children, not for my church, not for the lessons I carried, not for the patriarchy, not from capitalism, whatever, for me. And right now, not yesterday, not when I was a child, not tomorrow, not next year, not week, in this moment. This is what I know to be true for me right now. And when I really ask myself that and I sit with it and I answer it, because you can tell when you start to write something, you start to speak something, if you're not getting to the heart of it, you can tell. And maybe you can't get there right away. Again, you've got to build your capacity for this too. You've got to write it and go back and read it and go, okay, no, this was actually my mother's voice in my head, not my own. And you learn to tell what that truth feels like. You get really familiar with what it feels like when you've hit the point, which might not happen until a page and a half later. You actually get to the point of it. That's where I return when I'm kind of losing the path. The stuff on the surface still counts, but it's more, I think, instructive to show it takes a bit. It takes a while, unless you're really practiced at going right there, right? you have a better understanding likely of what trauma feels like and how it exhibits through your body and other people's bodies than most people because you're trained. This is your work. Most of us are walking around not understanding what that is and we're experiencing. So I've done more writing, and so I'm better at noticing what that truth is. But it doesn't mean all the stuff that winds my way there isn't important, because knowing what is not true or knowing what isn't quite it, I think is very helpful in determining what.
Yes. Okay, I think that's the piece that I was like trying to translate. Like, what does that mean? And there's this phrase of like, well, basically what you just said, but a lot of becoming who I am is about learning what I'm unbecoming or who I'm not.
Ooh, I love that line.
And in NARM, we call it disidentification. What am I disidentifying with? What am I sort
Yeah.
of like letting fall away? And it's
Right.
important. That process
Yeah.
is important.
And the flip side of that quote, it might be easier to go into is what is not true for me right now.
Okay.
Sometimes it is easier to develop what isn't than what is.
Oh, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I also wanted to highlight just this piece around in the therapy space where we're thinking presence, like what right now in this moment, like you said, not last week, not in childhood necessarily. I remember maybe my first experience in therapy, I was 18 years old. And to be quite honest, it was like actually really re-traumatizing. I did 10 sessions because that's what my insurance paid for. And I was just digging up childhood stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was kind of like, well, what now? Kind of like what you said. At the end of 10 sessions, I was just sitting holding it all. And I dug up all this stuff. And it wasn't useful because I had no idea what that meant for the present moment.
Right. What do you do in the present
What
moment?
do I do with it in the present moment? Yeah. So that's what feels like important for me, at least, in observing the work that you're doing is there's this piece around what does it mean in the present moment? Right now, what is the truth for me?
Yeah. I've got another piece that I've been working on that basically says, I don't believe everything I have written, but I do believe everything I write. Right? I no longer, some of those truths from the past are not true for me anymore. And that can be really hard, especially if you're thinking about putting this in some recorded form. Like, have you ever reread your journal and had that kind of hot flush of shame? Like, oh God, what was I thinking? I thought that this was XYZ, and actually it wasn't at all. Getting comfortable with that is also a really important part of living, speaking, writing the truth. That is going to change. Your truth is not a stagnant thing. What you know, what you've lived, the experiences you've had, they all come through to continually recreate what is true. Even when it comes to what happened in the past, your understanding of what happened when you were 5 is different this year than it'll likely be 10 years from now. Because you'll have lived more life and you have uncovered more things, and then suddenly the meaning changes. So again, not being so attached to the meaning we make is really important, whether it's just writing or being a human. Sure, I'm going to make meaning. We are meaning-making species. That is part of what we do. It's part of how we stay sane with all of what's coming at us. We decide what something means. But if you can loosen your grip on that meaning and allow it to shift and change as new information becomes available, you get a lot more space around the story.
Yeah. Yeah, the space around the story. And I think for me, at least, and maybe some listeners, that space around the story, even building up capacity to like be with the space and be with the unknown.
Be with the unknowing, yeah.
I mean, these prompts that you're naming, that's sort of like containing, like, let's bring it back to the present moment. Let's bring, I notice myself spinning out. I'm going to bring it back. What's grounding to me? What do I know right now for me? What's true?
Yeah. And that's one of the first lessons I learned when I brought a trauma educator into my writing classes. And one of the first exercises she taught me was that, as you know, and probably most of the listeners know, when we re-experience or re-engage with our trauma, our bodies are in that moment. They're not here. So one of the first lessons I taught that I teach people is, how do you ground yourself in the present moment? Like, here's my legs on this chair. I'm wearing gray sweatpants. It is 10:31 a.m. on Saturday, February 17th. I am here right now. So you might not be doing that in actuality. I might not be thinking, I'm sitting on my bed, my knee hurts, whatever. But any way you can bring yourself back into the present, which is what that does in writing form. That exercise is kind of like what I explained doing in a physical way to bring myself back into the present. I am not in that moment anymore. I am not inside that trauma. I'm actually here. But our bodies don't know that automatically.
Okay. This is gold. So this is like the equivalent I'm thinking of, like Yeah, presencing the, five senses,
Yes.
look around the room, like ground yourself in the present moment.
Mhm.
So when you're writing, you're not back there in the traumatic moment,
Right.
you're here in the present. So
And not even either or, because that would be a great exercise to do before you start to try to get to the truth.
Okay.
Grounding yourself in the present before
Okay.
you go.
Before.
Because
Yeah.
I mean, we are sometimes so far ahead of ourselves and so far behind ourselves at the
Yeah.
same time that it is really hard to be right here.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. We can be so far in the future and so far in the past and like absent.
Yeah,
From this
absent from the
moment.
moment. And being a mother and having kids they're great reminders of when you are
Mhm.
not in the moment. They know,
Yeah.
right?
I've got my 5-year-old. He's so patient. He'll just stand there, mama, 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 like, see
Yeah.
me, look, my eyes. I mean, he even grabbed my cheeks one time, mama, look at me. Oh, that's right. Sorry.
Right. Not only do we benefit when other people do that for us, not just our kids,
Yeah.
but how much benefit is there in doing that for ourselves?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
look at me, see me, be with me right now.
Yeah.
I am not 5 years ago me, and I'm not 5 years from now me. I'm this me. This is what I'm doing. This
Yes.
is the
Okay.
actual reality.
You hit on something really big, at least for me, this piece of we can do this for ourselves.
Mhm.
And what's coming up is like, I don't have to wait for someone else to do it for me. I can resource myself in this moment. And
Mhm.
again, that's what has felt really powerful, I think, in this truth of writing, of like what it can help us drop into.
Yeah. And I'm gonna keep reminding, like a broken record, it doesn't matter if you're just sitting with your thoughts in your head and doing this exercise, whether you're writing it in your journal, whether you're telling your best friend, or whether you're telling the world. The exercise, the experience of it is the same, no matter what way you're engaging with that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the experience.
Mhm.
Jeanette, there's a few more things I wanted to touch on before before I let you
Absolutely.
go.
I have a feeling we could do this for 3 more
We
hours.
could. We absolutely could. Can I ask you to read that last bit of the truth passage?
Yeah.
What is louder than trauma?
Yeah, and I mean, just to give some lead into that, is the voice of trauma is really loud, and it's really important to listen to and get familiar with and understand. But trauma and triggers themselves can be really unreliable narrators because they are in the past or in the future protecting you from something. Those triggers, the trauma that gets really loud and really activated and that kind of drowns out everything in the room, it's not unwise. It has so much wisdom to offer you, but can be a really unreliable narrator. It can be really bad at the meaning making part of this. And that is not a judgment, because my God, as humans, we are dealing with a lot all the time. But having that ability to step back and separate myself, the voice of myself right now, again, from the voice of my trauma or the trigger that's coming up for me, is for me vital. It's vital in writing and it's vital in living. So what you brought up here that you wanted me to read was, what is louder than trauma? Your heart, your truth, your light, your deepest knowing, your wholeness, the soft holiness of your human body, the way you still remember how to surrender into magic and mystery, the beauty of your offering, and your love, your damn good love.
Having a moment.
Now I want to hug you.
I know. Oh,
And I think we all need to hear messages like that. And what's important about my writing is I can look like I have it all wrapped up. Most often, the more authoritative I seem in my writing, the more I'm giving myself a talking to and being the voice I need to hear. A lot of my writing is me drowning out that trauma voice that wants to convince me that I'm broken, or I'm carrying around shame, or the world is not safe for me, or love is not safe for me, or whatever it's saying in that moment. Pull away, shut down, back off, go by yourself. I write to drown out those voices. Not to drown them out, I guess that's not right, because they're important to hear. They're important signposts and guides. But to make my own voice, to discern the voice of my heart, and to turn its volume up a little bit louder.
yeah.
And to get better over time at hearing it a little bit better, because there is a voice under that high activation danger zone, red light flashing space. There is always a space underneath that. It's really, really hard to get to sometimes.
So the creator of NARM, Dr. Heller, he talks about there's a piece of us, I believe, truly in my heart, I believe there's a core of me that is not touched by trauma, that is just like an essence that feels so, it's just the truth of me. And that part is never broken. There may be other parts of myself that are broken and maybe even need to fall away. But there is like a core of me that I have maintained, and my kind of a wisdom, that inner wisdom. And all of this that you're talking about, to me, it just keeps bringing me back to what is that core center piece that has not been touched by trauma, that is not broken. And how do I amplify that?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that, this writing bit, it is a creative force and it's a creative output into the world. But it's also a piece of healing. It also can be an important tool that individuals can use, therapists can use to guide people to that voice.
Jeanette, I'm so grateful that you were willing to have this conversation with me.
I'm incredibly grateful for getting the chance to be here with you and just let our wheels turn on all of it.
Riff a little bit. I'm curious if there's anything else that feels kind of unsaid or something that you'd want to share.
I mean, when it comes down to it, the important thing is what I said and what I reiterate over and over. When I say writing, I mean being with your story, whatever way that comes out for you or whatever way that comes out for your clients. It does not have to involve words on a page at all. I think that's the least part of the process. Like, that's the end point. That's where you get after you do all of that other work. And, really just testing out, what is the medium for you? Do you get to your truth faster and clearer and easier by speaking to someone? Do you get there in your journal? Do you get there by, in sitting meditation where you just let your mind go? As a writing teacher, people will often say, I'm so behind, I'm not keeping up with the prompts. And I think if you're sitting with the prompts at all, if you're reading them and letting them filter through your understanding, if you're being with the questions, living the questions, then you're doing that work. I call that writing. Words on the page, that's the final, quickest part.
I love that. It's the being with.
It's the being with. So I think maybe a good way to close isn't with a quote or a thought of mine. It's actually going back into the past and pulling forward some wisdom from quite a long time ago. It's a Rilke quote that's one of the guiding quotes of my life and really how I approach this writing journey. And he said, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given to you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will one day, then gradually without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer."
Jeanette LeBlanc, you are just so dear to my heart.
And you are dear to mine.
And how can our folks find you?
My website is JeanetteLeBlanc.com. On social media, it's all just my name. And then most of my writing lives now on Substack. So that address is substack.JeanetteLeBlanc.com. And it's an incredible platform for finding writers who are writing about important and real things. So I would suggest people who, if they love words and they love the power of story, to explore that platform in general. But you can start at my page.
Please. Thank you again. This has been a lovely Saturday morning.
It has been indeed.
So glad to have you. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The Level 2 training is a clinical training where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and C-PTSD. As you learn and integrate NARM, you will receive individualized support and join an engaged professional community of therapists passionate about healing complex trauma. Learn more about this training and reserve your spot by visiting www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.